Okay, cool. We're in. All right. So, hello, everybody. Welcome back. It's been a minute since I've uploaded anything. I'm Micah. Welcome back to Crusade Against Ignorance. And my hiatus is not without its benefits because I'm coming back with a really interesting topic today, as you have gleaned from the title. I'm very happy to be chatting about polytheism and arguments for and against it. Something I've been super interested in studying, like religions and some of my classes and stuff, and how certain pagan traditions matter to people, and I'm really interested in the actual literalist beliefs of these things, actual realism about the gods and polytheism. I find it super interesting, and my interest in philosophy of religion has waned recently, and so this is a good thing to get me back into it because this is really unique, and so I'm pretty excited to be talking about this. So my guest today is Stephen Dillon. I'm gonna be calling Dillon for most of this, so nobody get confused. So he's a polytheist who's interested in philosophy, and as we talked about a little bit before recording, that's a rare combination to find. So I was really excited to be able to talk to him. So Dillon, thank you for being here, and if you wouldn't mind telling us a bit about your background and how you came to be interested in this stuff.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I have been involved in philosophy for about 10 years now. I actually started off in seminary. I was going to be a priest, a Catholic priest, and I majored in philosophy. And about 2-3 years into that, I realized this was not for me. And I actually ended up leaving Christianity completely because I think looking back, retrospect is 2020, or hindsight is 2022. And I realized that I was raised to think that if only people were apprised of the same information that I had, well, then they'd be convinced of it. And I realized that people could have the exact same data set as me and come to different conclusions. And that probably obvious fact to other people shook me. And I began to question all sorts of theological and philosophical beliefs that I was raised in. And little by little, that process of questioning removed me from Christianity. And it set me on a couple years of soul searching. I was really curious to reconsider things that I had taken for granted. And when I was growing up as a Catholic, I wasn't really interested in philosophy. I saw it as like a over-formalized, opinionated field. It wasn't as sure as theology, is what I'd always been taught, was what I thought. And when I found myself without that theological ground underneath me, I began to reconsider those philosophical questions. And so I left Christianity. I became an agnostic, something of an atheist when I encountered Graham Oppy and Sobel and that whole crew. I mean, they blew me away. But during that process, I reconsidered something that I thought was being taken for granted, and that was polytheism. I scoured through the literature and I could not find a substantive interaction with this position. I would find scattered remarks and people like Swinburne, who would just mention in passing that polytheism was more complicated and just dismiss it. So I thought, in the interest of the project that I was engaged in, I wanted to steel man it. And when I steel manned it, I actually became convinced of it. And I was like, oh my God, I'm a polytheist. And so, that was about 2015. I published my findings, and the case for polytheism is what I called it. And I really thought I was reinventing the wheel. And I didn't have an organized view of the world at the time. I just presented these findings that I had with the tools that I had at the time, which was everything that analytic philosophy had given me, from logic to the vocabulary of metaphysics and so forth. After I published that, though, I discovered something, and that's that for thousands of years, there has been this worldview called Platonism. And the ancient Platonists actually were polytheists, and they had this whole system worked out with a special role reserved for gods. And I was just floored because, like I said, I thought I was reinventing the wheel. I thought I was doing some groundbreaking stuff, but really I was just playing in the sandbox while these intellectual giants had this whole organized view of the world. So I immersed myself in the readings I could find, mainly through the outlet of Dr. Edward Butler, who his material is a gold mine. It really is. And the availability he has, I think his website is henodology.wordpress.com. Most of his papers and even his dissertation, I believe, are available for free. And it just was such an eye-opener to me. So essentially where I ended up was taking this ancient philosophy, Neo-Platonism, as it's sometimes called, with the analytic bent that I had. And I found myself with a new project, which was translating all of that ancient verbiage, those concepts, into modern vocabulary for relevance, for development. Because I don't think just because these guys kind of close the academies and 600 AD that the concepts are done with. So yeah, that's what I've been doing. And the result was actually I just got a book published, Polytheism, an Analytic Approach. Comes out in August, and that kind of condenses my latest findings and hopefully presents a more organized view of the world, much more deeply metaphysical, I feel. And that is a long-winded way of an introduction.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's great stuff. Yeah, okay, that's interesting then, because I found this tendency too in the people I've listened to a little bit of a talk or a podcast interview with Dr. Edward Butler, and then I've reading some of Eric Steinhardt's stuff. It does seem to be the case that a lot of people that are polytheists are also kind of, in an important sense, Neoplatonists. So I'm really fascinated by that, and it's cool. I mean, it's a super powerful and interesting like worldview, and there's a lot to it. So I'm sure we'll talk about fleshing some of that out a little bit more. So yeah, no, that's great. As far as, I mean, yeah, this is a kind of a throwaway point, but I wanted to make it clear at the outset, we're talking about like actual polytheism here, because there's also, I have a video earlier on my channel called like Naturalizing Neo-Paganism, where I go through like these views of like how you could be like a metaphysical naturalist and then still like in an important religious sense be a pagan. And so I talk about like fictionalism and that as one option, and like naturalistic version, like visions of the gods in another. But so to be clear, like we're talking about like actual polytheism, like, the gods are actual entities that inhabit the world in the same way we do, or in a similar way that we do. I don't know if you'd phrase it that way, but that's how like, what's his name? Dr. Matthias Nordvig phrases it. He's particularly, so that's one thing I was going to ask you too. Speaking of Dr. Nordvig, he does a lot of stuff on Norse mythology. Are you is there like a particular like pantheon you believe in, or are you, because there's a handful of polytheists I've interacted with that I've seen that seems to be this kind of like very multi like approach, where it's like they kind of believe in almost all the pantheons, but there's also some people that are just Norse pagans, or just like Hellenistic polytheists or something. So where do you fall on that?
Let me answer that by touching on the fictionalism and then the sort of pantheonic focus. I believe there's different ways of looking at a god, different ways of seeing them, different ways of relating to them. So you have the experiential approach, which is where your image of that deity is formed by your experience with them or the experience of others. And that kind of relates to the mythic approach, which is where you understand who that god is, what they're like through their depictions in myth. But I came to polytheism philosophically. So the view I had of gods was that they played a certain metaphysical role, and that's how I understood them. So when I came to polytheism, it wasn't through a particular deity. It wasn't through a pantheon or anything like that. And it's interesting. I went through a time where I felt kind of spiritually lonely, and I reached out to different communities, and I was like, I feel like I should belong to something. Maybe this is because I'm coming from Christianity, from Catholicism, but I felt like I was missing out on community. And there was a certain point where I began having religious experiences with Asclepius, actually, which is kind of strange to me. I didn't know anything about him. It was such a surprise to me. And he's actually been the constant in my spiritual life through the years. So I do pray. I celebrate certain holidays. I'm a devotional polytheist to different deities, but my primary deity is Asclepius, I would say. So I'm not really a pantheonic, polytheist, which is actually interesting in the Neo-Platonic perspective. The philosopher Proclus talked about how a philosopher is supposed to approach pantheons, essentially. And he said, you need to be a priest of all of them versus just one. So this is kind of interesting.
Okay. Yeah, I like that for sure. Okay, cool. Yeah, I was trying to think about that in terms of a lot of the people who are polytheists that I've interacted with so far have been like Norse polytheists, just because and like that's kind of their pantheon, just because I've been most interested in like that mythology and like heathenry as a practice. So it makes sense people that because there also is like a heavier focus on the cultural aspect, but also the mythic perspective. Like they talk a lot about kind of coming to the gods through those avenues like you talked about. So okay, so that's an interesting perspective, and I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about like spiritual experience and stuff. So that's a good point. So yeah, that answered my question of like how many gods are there and how did you come to be a polytheist. So we could touch on also really quick this one thing we chatted about a little bit, which is this topic, and you kind of alluded to it in your introduction there, the topic of like neglect in philosophy of religion towards polytheism. And so we talked because there's this philosophy of religion is mostly just people talking back and forth about one or two arguments for like the Christian God, and it's just not that interesting of a dialect. It's part of the reason I was saying like I don't really care about much of that field anymore, is because it's kind of all the same stuff. There are other reasons I don't care about it, but that's a big one. And yeah, so just thinking of like, well, it just doesn't even seem like, for one thing, alternate views and alternate religions in general are vastly underrepresented in analytic philosophy and in philosophy simpliciter, but polytheism especially. And I feel like we could speak to this a little bit too. It's not even just like in the philosophical world, it's a pretty common sentiment I encounter. Like I've mentioned before to even like my parents or people that like, I'm like, oh yeah, I have a friend, because one of my closest friends is a polytheist as well. And so I've mentioned stuff like, yeah, I have a friend who's a polytheist. And it's usually kind of like met with like, I don't want to say scorn, because it's not that strong, but it's just kind of like a really, like that's kind of the reaction I get. It's just like when you say like, oh, I know this person who's a polytheist, they're like, wait, so they like actually believe in multiple gods? Like there's kind of this like incredulous stare moment that you always get. And so so that's not just like a sentiment it's not just underrepresented in philosophy of religion. It seems like the common sentiment of it is also like, this is a really like, people don't believe this anymore. Why would you? So I don't know that's a really like vague way of phrasing. That's not really a question, but what do you think about that?
I definitely share that experience with others. I rarely actually will bring up polytheism to others at like the workplace and friends even, because it is it's kind of socially taboo. It's almost looked down on, or it's just surprising for people. Like, really? Like people still think that? And it's interesting to me. I think one of the plagues that prevent people from taking polytheism seriously is mythic literalism. And that really blows me away, because the main world religions have mythic genres in their scriptures, like Genesis, for example. It's a mythic poem, and they're comfortable interpreting their scriptures and their imagery in symbolic terms. So if you told a Christian, for example, like it says here that God regretted making man. Did he really feel regret? Well, they'd be like, no, that's just a metaphor. So they're happy to apply metaphors and symbols to their text. But when they come to pagan myths, it's like, no. If it says that Zeus was a spiteful, whatever, that's what he is. It's like, whoa, wait. Why do we got to take myths literally? First of all, they are myths. So why would you take them literally? No one takes those literally except you. You know what I mean? So it's like, I think the whole vision of pagan gods has been tainted in society's eyes by mythic literalism. And when you talk to the actual practicing polytheists, who generally base their understanding of the gods off their experience, but to by extension, their interpretations of myths. Like nobody is going to take a myth literally. No one is going to say, if it says here that Zeus was unfaithful, then he was literally unfaithful. Like it symbolizes something, So that's my impression. That's kind of what I bring up. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, it's also because it happens a lot. Even with like biblical scholarship, it's like allegory is not only what is taken by a lot of people, like scholars, to be the correct way to read it. It's also like whenever you read something allegorically, it's always a much richer experience, like intellectually and like morally. Everything about it is like it's a much more interesting to read this as like revealing something more deeply true than just like as is a story about like Zeus or Odin like killing or raping somebody. It's like, well, that's not, of course there's more going on there. Like it's part of the reason people construct mythologies is to kind of concretize these bigger concepts in stories. And so that's a good point. I mean, as far as do you think there's anything more beyond that, like distinctive about the Neglectan philosophy? Because I think that's definitely true. Like what you said kind of explains a lot of the, kind of the incredulous stare from most people, the social taboo element of it. But as far as like philosophy particularly, do you think there's anything else going on there? Or do you think it's just kind of like, or is it maybe it's just a fact of historical contingency? Like, well, not a lot of people that have been into philosophy have held this view and like cared to defend it. So it might just be that's all there is to it. But do you have any further thoughts on that?
I do think that there was a monotheist narrative that kind of won the day, so to speak, and it's been grandfathered into societies. It's definitely gone from one hand to the next through the academies, and it's really interesting. When I was in seminary, I took an ancient philosophy course, and the textbook we used had selections from Aristotle, from Plato, from these thinkers, and it's convenient that a lot of these, college level textbooks will leave out sections of these works that mention their piety, that mention their belief in other gods. So Aristotle, Plato, for example, they're commonly thought to be monotheists. It's generally thought that ancient polytheists were more of like the common people. They weren't the actual philosophers. When what my kind of group is trying to do is show that these thinkers, these ancient heavyweights, were actually very much polytheists, and it wasn't a historical or tangential fact. It was integral to their philosophy. So I feel like this monotheist narrative has kind of controlled how the history of philosophy is read, and it's commonly thought that polytheism was never a serious contender philosophically, and that's something that I hope to change too. Like especially with Aristotle and Plato, like I mean their mentions of the gods and everything is so out in the sun. It's like, come on, But
True. Yes, and especially same once you get to the Romans, like, Cicero, and I think Sallust has the book like on the gods in the world or whatever. So it's like, yeah, you did with the ancients. They were deeply polytheistic. I remember, yeah, Edward. That was one thing in Edward Butler's interview we talked about a lot, was this kind of like, because like when like some of the Christian schools took over like Platonic thought or like Aristotelian thought, it's like, well, you kind of if you have like Augustine, the city of God, it's like, well, Platonic philosophy just becomes like Christianized, just like another way to like look at. And so you forget that like, no, Plato was like intensely polytheistic. And so and that's one thing he talked about a lot that I found valuable too, which is this true. It's just like, well, that seems to be the conception, partially because Christians then took the monopoly of these philosophers and like, oh, we're gonna use their philosophy to kind of like be smarter Christians, or kind of develop this kind of like particular Christian view. And with the Eastern Fathers and Neo-Platonism and stuff. And so, yeah, you forget that like with people that actually had like started these views or kind of came up with them were, I mean, yeah, like reading Symposium, like how much Socrates talks about Eros and like how much they talk about the gods interacting with each other, and like Euthyphro, like, yeah, it's very obvious that
it's very obvious.
yeah, for sure. So yeah, that's a good point. And I think that's true. That's probably part of the explanation. And that, it's probably like a larger, like the philosophy, the Neglectan philosophy is obviously not like totally disconnected from the larger cultural image, which is the same of like, okay, polytheism that's just like one of those old, like people used to believe that before we had science, but like now we have science, we know why lightning strikes and rain falls. Like we can still have Christianity, but like that's actually primitive religion. And so I don't think that sentiment and or the neglect in philosophy is completely separate from the popular sentiment we're talking about. That just there's this broader social historical narrative about like polytheism and yeah. So, but I mean, that's part of why I was excited to do this, and why I'm glad we're talking about it, is because I kind of want to push back on that in both spheres, both the popular and the philosophical, because I think there's obviously something interesting with this view, and it's definitely worth talking about. Like, it's just as worth talking about as Christian theism. So we want to talk about the actual arguments for and against it, I know, but that one more preliminary point, kind of related to what we were just talking about, which is like how to properly distinguish your view from a certain kind of like Christian way of speaking about things. Because so the like lower level of this is where you're told, like in Sunday school, that like people from like other religious traditions might have like experiences that they're gods, but those are really demons or something. And there's also there's, in the more kind of sophisticated sense, there are like Christian Neoplatonic views that allow for like lowercase g gods, in the sense, like the Bible refers to Satan as like a god at one point. And so there's kind of this you could, I guess what I'm getting at is that Christians might say like there's a way of talking about polytheism where it doesn't escape just like still being Christian. They're like, yeah, you have your like little gods out there, but like the fundamental, like you need like actual God. And it's like, well, if because like they're obviously not polytheists in the sense we're talking about, but they could be like, oh yeah, sure, have these like beings running around, but they're just kind of like these little things within creation. There's kind of like super persons, and then like there's actually God. So I guess the basic question is, how do you distinguish your view from like a Christian view that says like, well, we have God and then we have these little gods, but they're kind of like less important or something. Because I don't know if you would agree with something like the one, but the one would presumably be like impersonal, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this, but I guess just in general, like as far as distinguishing the view.
Where it gets interesting. So, yeah, we've created a term called henotheism, which is where you acknowledge the existence of many gods, but you worship only one, or you say only one is deserving of worship, something along those lines. And it's very common in the Abrahamic faiths, especially, to explain away pagan deities as either demonic or mere idols, or as existing but more like angels, for example, that sort of stuff. The arcing structure of that whole worldview is that there is one first principle, and then there's everything else in different levels. And I would fundamentally challenge that. So I would say that there are many uppercase G gods. And I would even say that this is where we'll have to wait for the argument, but
Okay,
I would say that monotheism is actually incoherent as a proposition. And
all right.
that it's actually, I would even go further, and I'd say that monotheism is materially equivalent to atheism. So that theism just is polytheism. That's what I would say.
Oh yeah, I love it. Okay, cool. And so this might we might just need to get in the argument. This might just sidestep a question I have, I think, when you get to the Neo-Platonist stuff. But one question like a friend suggested to me to ask, and that I've had too, was like, why assume the gods are supernatural as opposed to just like, well, they're natural entities? And this is also something I proposed in my naturalizing neo-paganism video. I was like, if you're a naturalist and you want to be a pagan, you could also be a polytheist. You could just say that, and it's not clear, because I mean, it's not clear exactly what that would look like, but it's something Mormons believe something similar, at least some members of the Church of Latter-day Saints. Like I have a friend who's a total like materialist and a Mormon, and so but I think honestly probably like we can maybe circle back to that question, because I think like doing a lot of the Neo-Platonist stuff will probably it makes that like supernatural natural distinction like a little bit messier. If you want to say anything about it now, sure, but if you'd rather just get into the argument, I'm also down for that, so whatever you'd prefer.
Yeah, there's so much to say on that. I will say I have over the last 10 years or so, I've created a lot of different arguments for polytheism. I've come at this from a lot of different angles. And like the argument in this book, for example, does kind of touch on the difference between natural and supernatural. And I'm coming at this more from the analytic perspective, which says more or less that nature is whatever else it includes, whatever an idealized science would be able to investigate. Nature is sensible and intelligible reality. Whatever else, that's what it is. So I say that if theism posits something that transcends nature, then it posits something that transcends sensible and intelligible reality. And that just is ineffable reality. That's what it is to transcend intelligibility. So how I kind of cash out supernatural is in terms of ineffability, which through another argument I say is the negative side of individuality. Like if you think of a proposition, you have a subject and a predicate. So what happens when you consider the subject qua subject? When you take away the predicate, the subject in and of itself is literally indescribable because there's no predicate. It is ineffable. So that's how I cash out ineffability, is the negative side to individuality. So when you say that there is something ineffable, something that transcends nature, what you're saying is there is something that's purely individual. By the way, that knocking on the door, that's my dog trying to get in. I apologize. I'm trying to like shoo her away. But, so just to touch on that distinction, that's one way you could cash it out, is that to be natural is to be sensible and intelligible, and to be supernatural is to be ineffable individual. But you certainly don't have to cash it out like that. And I'm actually more of a monist as a Platonist, which is what we could get into.
Right.
And that's that everything, absolutely everything partakes of unity. Unity is the most fundamental way of being, essentially.
Okay, great. Yeah, the unity stuff is fun. Okay, cool. Yes, let's get into it. The main event, as it were, the arguments for polytheism, what everybody's here for. So yeah, I mean, I was trying to think of arguments, and it's somewhat of a lack of imagination on my part. The one I thought of was just like, I think it's honestly one I kind of got from you, because you posted about this on Twitter, like about polytheism being like the most straightforward explanation of like a lot of data. And I thought about that too, of just like, well, yeah, you could probably run this sort of like inference the best explanation from like certain like religious experiences, like the fact like all these diverse religious experiences, people seem to confirm like this deity came to me or spoke to me. And I've heard a lot of, it's funny too how similar, like I guess I didn't expect this, maybe I should have, but like how similar certain, like when I asked some people in like a group one time, like, so how'd you come to like believe in the Norse gods? And like a lot of the conversion stories were very similar to like stuff Christians would say, like personal experience wise, of like, oh, I had this dream and like it meant this to me, or like, you know, I had like this significant event happened to me, and then like a raven came to me the next day, and like, oh, that's Odin. And so there's kind of this tendency people have to, I guess, and I've been there too, as somebody who's like kind of been part of like the skeptic, like atheist community, to kind of like sneer at those things in a way sometimes, of like, oh, believe. But partially I've gotten away from that a little bit, I think, and it's helped studying religion, taking like religion classes at university, and having a professor who works on religion and talking to her a lot about this. It's just like it's really kind of sloppy in a way to deny people's like personal experiences in that way, like to just say like, oh, you never want to do the thing of like, oh, you cannot interpret that way. And it's like, no, it's like when people come to tell me like, hey, I had this dream, or like I think it's Freya speaking to me and like wanting to work with me like as a deity, it's like, well, there might have been a tendency I used to have to be like, sure, whatever, we all have dreams. But it's like, but now when you actually get into studying religion, it's like, well, no, religious practices and spirituality, like, is a lot of it's about people making you know, things that are meaningful to people as like people and as religious seekers. And so you can't like be dismissive or reductionistic while also being like an accurate scholar of these things. And so it's like, well, no, part of the way people read meaning into and out of these kinds of life experiences is really important. And so I was just thinking about that in terms of polytheism. Like, we have a lot of people across a lot of continents and times and places that have similar experiences and report similar, like, you know, again, different deities, different names and such, but similar kinds of experiences. And there's even like, you know, there's similarities across a lot of mythologies, like serpents show up in Apophis in Egyptian mythology, Jormungandr in Norse mythology, the serpent in the garden. So it's like there's just so much commonality, and like it just seems like there's a pretty widespread. So I guess this was the argument. This is what I thought of. Like if I was beginning to give a case for polytheism, I would just say like, well, look at the way people interpret these experiences as meaningful to them and important to them, and look how widespread that is, and like how kind of consistent the data has been. Well, it seems like you could explain that by saying, well, it's just you have God and then his demons are tricking all these people. But it seems like the more straightforward way to look at that is just like, no, there's a lot of gods, and they interact with people in a lot of ways. So yeah, I don't know. What do you think of that? So sorry, I don't mean to take away from your actual argument. I want to get into that as well, but that's one thing I was thinking of.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting take. I think there are, like I said, there's different ways of looking at the gods. All right, real quick, let me just do a quick caveat on contemporary philosophy of religion. I feel like philosophy of religion has become a cryptozoology where we track these ethereal super beings by their causal footprints. And I feel like that's how gods are treated nowadays. You look for the evidential chips and stuff like that. I feel like we've gotten away from um, deducing gods as playing metaphysical roles in an overall system. Like, if we didn't have this, we wouldn't have this, that kind of thing. We're doing philosophy of religion differently nowadays. So I feel like within that contemporary realm, that bent, you can certainly look for evidential considerations that will tell you one way or another how many gods there are. I think one of the most prominent ways of doing that is religious experience, like you brought up. I do say sometimes that polytheism is the most straightforward interpretation of the data, because I feel like, I guess I would word it like this: the simplest explanation is the one that just takes the data for granted, just takes it as is. And I feel like that's what polytheism does with religious experiences. It doesn't try to say they're just neurochemical interactions. It doesn't say that they're really misperceptions of a single deity or something like that. It just takes them as they are. If you say that you perceived Zeus and you say that you perceived Odin, all right, we'll take it as is, So I feel like polytheism has that theoretical virtue as far as an explanation of that empirical data. And that's kind of how I started in my journey with polytheism. Is I was running with inference as the best explanation, Bayesian analyses. I was looking at that kind of stuff. Nowadays, I'm a lot more metaphysical, I would say. I'm happy to get into the empirical weeds, so to speak, but my overall approach now is to identify a metaphysical whole and say, whatever fills that is a god. And if you deny that, then the world doesn't make sense anymore. You're missing something essential in that, overall explanation, I guess. Okay. So if you wanted me, I could get into the argument.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, no, sounds good. Yeah, it's all fascinating stuff. Yeah, I just was going to point out, it's a very interesting similarity. Like your methodology. So like, yeah, in a lot of philosophy of religion, even especially coming out of people like Swinburne and like Paul Draper and such, it's like, well, there is a tendency to think about this in terms of like, well, let's take our priors, which I mean, as an aside, I really hate Bayesianism. It's a terrible epistemology, but it's nonsense. But anyways, but there is this kind of, but doing like abduction is different. It's like I'll give you that, but that's kind of the methodology of like, let's take these principles, like our priors or whatever, if you want to talk about it like that. And like, here's the evidence. And so, but what you're doing sounds more similar to like, and I know you mentioned like a history with Thomism, and it seems like there's an interesting similarity there, where there are people who prefer going about it in terms of like giving like, deductive proofs of like, well, you have to believe God exists, because if you don't, you can't explain like X, Y, Z, like contingent things or like things in motion and such. So it's an interesting similarity. Because yeah, it is true. I think a lot of people in philosophy of religion are beholden to that former perspective for various reasons. I mean, hey, I'm not an evidentialist, so we're good. I'm not an internalist, so we're good. But yeah, no, so yeah, that was like an aside, like an interesting kind of convergence of methodology between like polytheism and like Thomism, which is like you don't expect to agree on much, but that's kind of cool. But yeah, I'd love to hear. Yeah, whenever you're ready, I'm really curious.
Yeah, just on that point real quick, I sent a reading manuscript of Polytheism and Platonic approach to Graham Oppie. 100% did not expect him to read it because I'm like, here's like one of the most famous philosophers ever, more busy than I can fathom. He read it and he actually gave me a blurb, and he said, in there, he said something like, the reader will find striking similarities between this and Thomism. I thought it was really interesting because through recent scholarship, especially from the recently deceased Wayne Hankey, we have learned that Aquinas was deeply Platonic, and he thought, well, we won't get into all that stuff, but basically, the Platonic academy that ran for 500-600 years, that was called Neo-Platonism, their material survived in different forms through translations, through authoring, and it survived in the Islamic philosophical schools, and then through Thomism, which became, so it's like essentially, yeah, this identification with this methodology in Thomism, there's an older form of it, like Proclus's Elements of Theology, which is like my Bible. It is very systematic, and it's just one proposition after another, sort of like how Spinoza did his. But anyway, on to the show.
That's interesting. Yeah, no, Graham's a great guy. As an aside, he's what a cool dude. Yeah, he responded to a bunch of my emails even like a couple of years ago. Like we had like 10, 20 back and forth. I was like, dude, I'm just like some random undergraduate.
Yeah.
Like it's like he's awesome.
He's amazing. Yeah.
Great dude. But yeah, anyways, yeah, let's do it. Let's go full ancient philosophy.
All right, with a contemporary bent. I like it. So I guess for a contemporary audience who's never heard anything like this, but who may be accustomed to some of the contemporary terminology, just know that I will be taking for granted that nominalism is false. That's something I think that they were fine doing back in the day, because like nobody really had any serious arguments for it. Obviously today, nominalism is taken a lot more seriously. There's a lot of alternatives, but for the interest of time and stuff, I'm just going to assume that some form of Platonism is correct. Okay. So having said that, the data that we'll be looking at is unity. So what we're going to start with is this is called the argument from totality. It's given by Damascus, one of the last Platonist philosophers before all the academies were shut down. This is the argument from totality. So I wrote a little piece on this so I wouldn't drift. I'm just going to kind of read what I got here. So what unifies all things into a totality is that they are individuated. So we're talking about totality. So when you think of the totality of all red things, what unifies them into that totality is that they have redness in common. They're all red. That's the thing that they have in common. When you think about the totality of all things, absolutely everything, no matter what they have in common is that they are each individuated. So all things, no matter what, they have a unity or integrity as themselves. They have an identity. And there's going to be obviously some pushback. Some people might say, I think what all things have in common is that they exist. You might say that. But even existence has identity, has the identity of existence. It's existence, not horse. You know what I mean? Whatever you come up with as an alternative, it will have an identity of its own. Even you might say unity. Unity has the unity of unity, so it's not self-defeating. This is the one thing that captures everything, no matter what, has this. When you start to philosophically reflect on what everything has in common, what unity is, it's what the Platonists called henos, or oneness. You see that it functions almost like a form of being. All things have this. They are one by participation. They have individuation, by participation. But this thing that they have in common, it is unity primarily. That is what I would call a God. This thing that includes everything else, the all, as Platonists would call it, the totality of all things. This is a God. And the reason I would use that term is because you might say, like, in the totality of red things, for example, redness is a color. In the totality of all things, the one, the thing that makes things count as individuals, it is the most individual thing. It's the most one. It is unity. So that's why I would call it God. It precedes everything that partakes of it, which is everything. It's first, it's ultimately transcendent. But in being ultimately transcendent, it is completely immanent. And to clarify, this isn't like a form of crude pantheism where you might say a God is like a form and everything else is like matter, because even matter has to be individuated. So you could think of it like this. A God is like the form of self for all selves. They partake of that form in order to be a self, in order to be an individual. So yeah, I think that kind of maybe introduces this concept to a more modern audience. That's how I would see a God. And one way you can argue for a God, just from the totality of all things, the thing that everything has in common, that's a God. So I guess the question arises now, how many gods are there? What I want to argue is that it makes no sense to say there's only one. The only one of what exactly? There's nothing outside of the totality of all things. There's no broader category for it to be the only member of. If this is ultimate reality, unity, there's nothing more fundamental than it, then you can't quantify it in more fundamental terms. You can't say this is the only one of what, there's nothing else. So monotheism is fundamentally a sort of confusion where it tries to existentially negate other ultimate realities and try to quantify this. It ends up treating ultimate reality like it's not ultimate, essentially. Where was that? So yeah, so in reserving the name God for something that is quantifiable, something that's not God, monotheism is materially equivalent to atheism, because it's tacitly assuming that there is no God. There's nothing beyond being. Even God, according to monotheism, can be captured by number. Even God can be surrounded by a category and be its only member. And no, I'm not talking about Abrahamic monotheism. I got that earlier today when I was discussing this. I am analyzing monotheism itself. To say there is only one God is to say that there is only one of something. And the conception of deity that I'm working with here, that just does not make sense on. So that would be one response to monotheism. It's materially equivalent with atheism. That means that no matter which God there is, it cannot be the only one. So polytheism must be true. But the question might arise, it certainly did for me, does polytheism succumb to this same problem? Because to say that there are many gods might be to say that there are many of something. It might require there to be a category, a set, a group for there to be many members of. So it's important to address that. I would say this is where Edward Butler's theory of polycentricity really comes to play. The idea is that we're talking about gods here. So they have a plurality, I would say that's been established from the impossibility of monotheism. There is a plurality of gods. So they have something in common. There's something that unites them as gods. But because we're talking about gods, what they have cannot be less ultimate or more ultimate than they. Because if it's more ultimate than them, then they're not gods. So the only thing they can have in common is themselves. That's the only thing that two gods could have in common, is another god. But because they're gods, I would say they're not composed of parts. They're the form of self for all selves. They're simple, utterly simple, manifested through all things prior to everything. They're the first principle. So they have each other by being each other. Each god is the form of self for all the other ones. And this is true for each of them. Each god is the one, essentially. This is polycentricity. Each god is a unique way of being other gods. They are a unique way of being all things. And like I said, this isn't a crude pantheism because it's not matter and form. It's not like mind and body. This is a monism of unity. The most fundamental way of being is of being one. So yeah, I would say from the impossibility of monotheism, it follows that polytheism is true. And when you think about how polytheism could be true in its context, you have to conclude some kind of polycentricity, which is where this plurality of gods has many centers instead of one. Like the plurality of red things, it has one thing, one center, redness, that they all partake of. But that kind of model of plurality doesn't work when you get two gods. They can't have just one thing because they can't have things in that way. They have to be them. So they don't have one center, they have many. In some ways, you might say polytheism is acentric. There is not one center, it's any of the gods can be in this role. So you might think of a god as the center and everything else as the periphery. And this is true for all the gods. So in one respect, Zeus is the periphery of Odin. And in another respect, that relation is reversed. So that is the best I could condense this argument. But like I said, it was initially given by Damascus in his reflections on first principles. He really, really digs into totality. And I've been trying to update the language. Like I was thinking of the relationship of totality as being between the totalans and the totalanda, and different ways of spelling this out. But this is more or less how I would do it. Did that make any sense? Have I totally jumped the shark here?
No, it's really interesting. You know, I mean, it's on one hand, like, yeah, I need to be more familiar with like Neo-Platonic stuff than I am. So, but it's a good explanation. I mean, I guess as far as clarification questions, I have like at least two. I mean, there's one, we got back to the monotheism point of like ruling out monotheism. And you probably addressed this implicitly in what you said, but just to clarify for me, because I might have missed part of it, is that there are, it sounded to me sort of like, and I don't necessarily like trading this terminology, but it's part of the God debate nowadays. So, but there are some monotheists, it seems to me, that are very Neoplatonic, and that like they're classical theists. So they would kind of agree with you that the certain kind of monotheism you sketched is impossible but they take God to be like beyond being or something, and like they're like, well, you know, yeah, he's not in this. You can't categorize him the same way you categorize other things. And so I guess the clarification question is that kind of view. What's the problem for that on your? So what is the reason that you need multiple gods? Supposing that you were to clarify and say, well, you know, my conception of capital G God is as this sort of like fundamental, sort of like metaphysical principle by which everything, you know, has its being and moves within it, and by which everything else is made intelligible. Like being itself, this language this kind of comes up. So how would yeah, how would the case go of like if that kind of monotheism, is that still impossible?
Great question. Actually, they're the group that I get the most pushback from. I find that analytics um, tend more to want to talk about things like Occam's razor, um,
Yeah.
explanatory competitions and stuff, but the classical theists really have beef with polytheism. And I've written a lot about it. Thomas Aquinas, for example, wrote a considerable amount of substantive thought on polytheism, which I was like, oh, finally. So here's what I would say, and I hate to say this to my classical theist audience, but classical theism is a watered down version of Platonism. They inherited principles and took them in a new direction, one specifically tailored to creedal monotheisms, and they erected cathedrals of reason. I totally acknowledge that, but it is at the end of the day a watered down version of something I think far greater. So part of the problem, I believe, is that the classical theist thinks that the first principle is being, and they'll say that God is ipsum esse subsistens and stuff like that, being itself. When I would say the first principle is unity, it's not being. And this is something Proclus talks about in his Elements of Theology. Being and unity are not the same thing, even though Aquinas said they were. He said that they were, essentially the same thing from different perspectives, convertible. Even being itself has an identity. It has the unity of being. It's not horse, it's not cat, it's not any of these things. It is being. So even being partakes of unity. Unity is the first principle. So this goes back to my point that monotheism is a form of atheism. Even the classical theist identifies as God something that is not. They'll say being itself, this is God, but it's not. That's not the first principle. It may be true that you can only have one being itself, but that's not God. So what does it matter? Like, why is this relevant to this discussion? I love bringing this up with them. It is definitely a disagreement on first principles, but at the end of the day, what I generally say is that my beef is with the monotheist proposition. However you cash that out, whoever articulates it, the proposition that there is only one God demands that a God belong to a category as the exclusive member. It demands that there is something for a God to be the only one of. And so,
yeah, okay, that makes sense.
And so if the classical theist isn't affirming the monotheist proposition, then I don't have any beef with them, because they're not going to disagree with me as a polytheist. But it's that proposition I have beef with. And then I would also say that polycentricity, as I was explaining it, is the idea that to be a God, part of that very concept is to be a way of being all things. That's what it is to be a God, is to be the totality of all things, the uppercase S self that all selves partake in. So the idea that you could have just God or just one God doesn't make sense, because to be God is to be a multiplicity of gods. And that's true for each of them in the position of how I articulate in this, I won't get into because that's a whole other conversation, but in the subject position, each God is the one. And in the predicate position, each God is like a power of that God. So did that make any sense?
Yeah, the point about the exclusive categories is interesting, and I like that. So I mean, but to clarify, so supposing that somebody like in the classical theist vein were to, or maybe not, because maybe they're like, that term is referring like to people who are committed to this idea about being as first principle, but like, so supposing there was somebody who's like a Platonic monotheist of sorts, and they agree with you about the and I think you just addressed this point, the exclusivity thing, but just to make it like really clear, I wanted to like make sure it's like stated multiple times for me and for potential audience members as well. This idea of, well, supposing somebody said, well, no, I agree with you, unity is the fundamental like first principle, like that's what we have to start with. And but they just say, yeah, but there's just one God that's unity itself, or like exemplifies unity. So I think this is the point you're making about that not being possible with the exclusivity thing. But as you were saying, like, but I wonder how that relates to what you called like the monotheist proposition, because it sounds like maybe you could maybe like disagree with the monotheist proposition that you were talking about, but then when you ask somebody like, well, what's your view? Like, I just believe in one God. So what do we do with that kind of thing? Yeah.
Remind me to come back to naturalism on this point.
Oh yeah.
And just real quick on that point, I feel like Platonism is to polytheism what naturalism is to atheism. It's kind of the only game in town, I feel. All right, having said that, and bracketing naturalism and how it could incorporate what I would call a henodology, this theory of unity, I would say that due to the failure of monotheism, it doesn't matter which God you believe in, whether it's Allah or Yahweh or whoever, it can't be the only God. It can't, because then it would belong to a category as the only member and no longer be a God. So if it is a God, in fact, it cannot be the only one. So the question then is how does polytheism work? And that's where polycentricity comes in. Like, if we're really talking about gods here, and this is something I hit Aquinas on all the time, is that when he objects to polytheism, he stops treating these objects as gods, and he starts treating them as creatures, and he subjects them to standards that only apply to natural things. But if we're really talking about gods here, they can't have things like properties. They're simple, so yeah, essentially I would say to these guys, feel free to believe in God, whoever that is to you. But if you say it's the only one, that's where you fall into atheism, because then you're calling something God that's not God, I would say. And there is a movement to say that in classical theism, that God is neither one nor many, that he transcends number. And this actually comes back to a point you asked earlier, how many gods there are. And if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I probably would have had some arbitrary answer like, well, we need to posit the least amount as possible, that kind of thing. But from this system, the systematic approach, the principle of individuation, the thing that individuates everything, precedes number, because it individuates even number. Number has an identity as number. So this principle precedes even number. And to say that means that the amount of gods, strictly speaking, is not numerically determinate. And this is another problem with monotheism, because they implicitly, definitely not of their, by their will, but they subject deity to number. And they say that there is a number, one, that determines the amount of gods. But what I'm saying is gods precede even number, because they are the first principle. They individuate everything. So strictly speaking, it's not one or many. It's indeterminate, which is polytheism, I would say. And this is something that the Platonists talked about. They said that the upper bound of the gods is indeterminate, because, like I said, they transcend number even. But they said the lower bound of gods cannot be fewer than the series of participations that there are. So I was saying how each god is like an uppercase S, self, for all selves. That unique character of each god traces down through reality, and it forms a series. So all things are Zeusian, you might say. You might say all things are Odinic, in a way. All things are Poseidonian, I don't know, you can just keep going. There cannot be fewer gods than there are series of that participate in that unique character. So they say the upper bound is indeterminate, the lower bound cannot be fewer. So yeah, I feel like that's a non-arbitrary, philosophically interesting way of answering how many gods there are. Instead of saying there are 243, and then you'd be like,
that's what I was gonna That's what I was going to tell you. So I was hoping I was going to ask that question. You were just going to be like 17, and I was like, okay, I
17.
guess I'll take your word for it. That's pretty
Yeah.
funny. Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
And on that note, I'm sorry, I'm just going to ramble here for a second, but
Oh, go for it.
it's interesting to me when Trinitarians argue with polytheists, because we have it in
Yeah.
common that we include plurality with divinity. And so what I find a lot of times, they don't even realize it. And these are high profile thinkers too. They don't even realize it, but what they're objecting to proves too much. Their objections prove too much. They're arguing against divine plurality as such. And so I often point that out, and I'm fine with two quoquays. I'm like, hey, I don't have the disadvantage here, because guess what? Now you're a Unitarian, or you're Muslim now. So, you know.
Yeah, you got to be a modalist. Yeah. No, okay, that's interesting. That relates to this question I had. I wouldn't phrase it as an objection. It's not an objection to polytheism, but I was thinking, like, I think you covered it there. But like, the question I was going to ask was something like, well, given this sketch you've given, like, where there have to be multiple gods, like as first principle of something, and the reason being that if you just posit one god, it's like, it's this category by itself, whatever. Then it seems like you only need two, because it's like, well, then it's not in a category by itself, and they've got the like individuation thing, but it's like, do you need more than two? So what about that? Like, we can just give the metaphysical like demonstration you did and just say, well, for simplicity's sake, we only need two gods, and we avoid this objection to monotheism. So like, there's just two of them. I think you might have addressed that a little bit, but like, just to make it like a little, like, just to clarify for me, but
Say that the amount of gods, strictly speaking, has to be numerically indeterminate.
Right.
Yeah, because otherwise, number precedes deity, and deity no longer individuates all things. It only individuates all things up to number. So So strictly speaking, it can't be 1, 2, 3, 4. It can't be a determinate number, which is really hard to think about. But
yes, so they're just infinite, or
it's like, it's not even infinite. It's just indeterminate. So it's like, it's like a mystical philosophy. I kind of like that about that. But I feel like that's a non-arbitrary substantive reply to that line of inquiry. But by the way, if 243 or 17 is arbitrary, 3 definitely is arbitrary. So take that, Trinitarians.
I like that. I like that connection. Yeah, no, that's the point about, like, number being kind of like derivative and not primary. I think we'll address it, but I want to make it clear of like, why not just say there's two? And I like getting back to that again, like because analytic philosophy mind, I'm like, why not just shave away all those other ones and like just have two? And it's like, so it's good, because it's like, that's what the analytic philosophers listening to this are going to be thinking. They're like, well, even if that's true, you only need like maybe a god and a half. And it's like, all right, okay, cool. Yeah, no, I like this a lot. I find it really interesting. I was trying to think what I was going to ask. I had like well, I know you wanted to circle back to naturalism. I don't know if you want to do that now, or I did have a couple, like a question. I think it's 2 questions that are kind of related, but they're kind of like probably ones you're going to want to say a good bit about. So do you want to come back to the naturalism thing first? Or maybe that'll be, actually, I wonder if that work into my questions here. I don't know. But yeah, do you want to talk about that now, or what?
Yeah. Can I just segue into that by addressing the objection that monotheism is simpler than polytheism?
Oh yeah, go for it.
Okay, so this is where I kind of take off my whatever hat I usually wear and I put on the analytic hat. I would say that it is just as much of a commitment to say that there's only one God as it is to say that there are many. We are both essentially qualifying the belief that there is a God. We're specifying the amount after that. You might think, from an analytic perspective, it's no more of a commitment to say that there are many than it is to say there's only one. We both have to have reasons for that. Mine's not more complicated than yours, I would say. And I would also say that, given what I've said so far, I would argue that monotheism actually posits a more complex entity, because the monotheist God belongs to a category. It is an instantiation of some more general divine nature. It is the only one that instantiates that nature, or whatever. So it's more complex than the simple polytheist God, which is a polycentric being. It's simple. And then on that note, I would say, the last note for this, I would say, Polytheism has an inner logic to it. It has a theoretical neatness or tidiness where answers to these questions just kind of fall out and they don't have to be kind of stitched together with external considerations and ad hoc and stuff like that. It's just this internal flows. This is why there's many gods. This is why the amount of gods is not determined by number, that kind of stuff. So I would say polytheism is simpler than monotheism in the respect that it has a theoretical neatness and tidiness. And I feel like theoretical neatness is the chief component of explanatory simplicity. So that's one way I would come at that objection. Did you have anything you want to say about that, or?
I thought I did at one point, but actually I don't think so. I think that covers it.
Oh, I definitely ramble, so my bad.
No, that's good.
So naturalism. This is a more recent project of mine because I honestly just kind of got bored with monotheism. I feel like nobody wanted to talk about it. Yeah. Nobody wanted to interact. So I was like, okay, I'll move on to something else. So I was like, how would Graham Oppy handle this? I've seen how he handles Thomism. I've seen how he's handled, more analytic approaches. How would he do this? And I thought, for sure, he would try to find a way to just say, yeah, unity is part of nature. Like nature is this whole, and there's many, they're the henads, as the Platonists call them. I understand the philosophical need for these. I got it. So this is nature for me, the totality of all things. So why should I worship them? I feel like that's where he would come at it. And I feel like that also ties into Sobel. If you read his like introductory definitions and stuff, he characterizes God as something that deserves worship, that kind of stuff. That was his focus, not so much metaphysical role that it plays, but it has to be worshipable, I guess. So I feel like that would be the avenue for naturalists. I would say it would not be in their interest to deny unity, right? Because everything's individuated. And I would say that polycentricity follows through a strict entailment. So I would say their grounds would probably be to just question why these henads or the one should be seen as divine. Like, why do we use that term? Like if you read Spinoza, for example, he just deduces all this stuff, and then out of nowhere, he starts calling this thing God, and you're like, why? Yeah. So I feel like that would be a fruitful ground for an interaction between polycentric polytheism and naturalism. All right, let's grant everything you say. Now, why do we worship these things? Kind of thing.
Okay, sorry, are you done? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, this actually does then. My sort of intuition a second ago was right. This sort of relates into the thing I was going to ask, which is, I wasn't necessarily thinking of it in terms of worship, but that was a question I was thinking about for later. But the worship question I noticed put in the Google Doc was more so based on like the mythic literalism point. If I've heard people say like, why do you worship Odin? Didn't he like rape somebody in this one? And it's like, well, okay, no, he did. Like Odin didn't, mythic Odin. But so what we already talked about kind of gets through some of those objections. But what I was going to ask about sort of was, I guess it was two separate but pretty closely related questions, and they're actually pretty closely related to this naturalism point. So let me see if I can phrase this in a way that's kind of like keeps the thread as one and is intelligible. So the idea is, supposing we've given this demonstration of these things, it's like, okay, we need these metaphysical posits to like make sense of anything. So there's a few questions then that follow from that. And these are questions that kind of like somebody like me might ask, but people might just have in general, which is, well, okay, so why assume, or in what important sense are these things gods? And what I mean by that is, it sounds like the space they occupy and the kind of the explanatory framework is rather similar to like abstracta or something, which are, maybe not necessarily in the sense of being like causally inert, but maybe they are. But maybe that's one thought there too, of just like, well, say we need these things to like make unity intelligible. And the other question was more also about like personhood, and this is where it comes up, kind of related objections people have to classical theism, this point about like ultimate simplicity, and well, it doesn't seem like a completely simple being. It's hard to make sense of how such a thing could be a person in the relevant sense. Having like sort of like temporal passage, like experiences, like making decisions, making choices, like interacting. And so it seems like when we think about gods, we think about them as like the kinds of entities that, like, especially with polytheism, like interact with the world in like an important causal way, but also maybe interact with us in an important way. And this forms like the basis people. So I guess the first part of the question was like, okay, well, how do we distinguish, like, what's distinctive about these things as gods? Because yeah, somebody like Graham Oppy might say, sure. And like, so kind of back to your point about naturalism, like somebody like Graham Oppy might just say like, sure, those things, I have those things somewhere in my, to explain like unity, but like in my framework, they're just like abstract objects, like all of causal reality is just like natural. So they haven't like really changed my ontology in this sense beyond like me just being like a mathematical Platonist or something. So I guess that's part of the question, is like, well, in what sense is polytheism importantly distinct from, like, say, Platonism about mathematics? How are these things personal in the right kind of way? And the related question to this was like, well, can these gods act on the world? Like, can they act on or in the natural world that we inhabit? It seems like part of the motivation we discussed earlier for polytheism was people's kind of personal experiences with these things. And if they're just kind of these like impersonal, floating out there, like, I'm not being uncharitable. I'm just kind of, just for for the sake of kind of talking about it. I completely blanked on the word I was going for there. Sorry. But yeah, so I guess that's the point. I was like, well, do these things act in the world? If so, how? And like, why? Like, why would they do that? So it does come back to the worship worthy point a little bit. It seems like, and this is because this is an argument people who are monotheists but not classical theists give to classical theism, which is that, well, this being you're talking about, it doesn't seem like it makes choices in a relevant way or is capable of standing in the right kinds of relations to me that would make me want to worship it. So like, why would I? And you could maybe say the similar thing about these kind of like Platonic entities. Sorry, that was a lot to throw you. There's like 7 different questions, but I hopefully like the thread is, yeah. I mean, I guess, so I get it to make it clearer, like the first basic question is, why assume, or in what important sense are these things gods? And like, what are they doing that's like goes above and beyond what like mathematical Platonists think numbers are doing in like an explanatory framework? I mean, maybe they aren't, but I would assume, but yeah.
So this brings up a lot. So let me start by apologizing. I am not a speaker, I'm a writer. So this is like a skill that I'm gonna to get better at, but this is like, yeah.
So, you're doing great.
So there is a difference, I think, between causal models and constitutive models of the first principle. And I feel like what we're used to is like the Thomistic, the I don't know, anything nowadays that's a causal model. We're thinking of the first cause. It is efficiently causal, has free will, it makes decisions, stuff like this. When you read the Platonists, they were very clear that the one does not make decisions. It doesn't make choices. It's not causal. They talked about how reality emanates from the first principle. It is not created. So this is a big difference between polytheism, I would say, and monotheism. The one constitutes all things. This is the constitutive model. It is the uppercase S self of all selves. And that's why it can be considered as an individual, you might say, because it is the self. It is an individual. It's like this ultimate one who is beyond being, and everything, no matter what, is a participation in its selfhood, its individuality. But because it is so far up there, because it is at the very top, it doesn't experience decision making. It doesn't experience change. It doesn't experience those sort of things in and of itself. It is just the underlying unity for all things. And so that actually plays into the problem of evil. The problem of evil focuses on what morally sufficient reason could there be for allowing this. And monotheists are typically in the position of having to try to say, God could have stopped this, but he chose not to, that kind of stuff. Whereas on Platonism, reality emanates necessarily from the one. It's not created, it's constituted. And evil, like Plato says in the Timaeus, is inevitable. It is an inevitable feature of the lowest level of reality. So I feel like I just threw a whole bunch of stuff out there. There is this interesting gap that I'm still theorizing about, which is you have the one, you have the henads, you have these the principle of individuation. That's the philosophical need for all of this. You have that, and then you have these religious experiences where people have dreams, or they might just be sitting in a room and suddenly have this overwhelming sensation that there is a god, Isis, and she is all things and all these things. So there seems to be this gap between the principle of individuation and then these like more concrete individuals that people encounter, you might say.
Yeah.
And like I said, it's something I'm still theorizing about, but I don't necessarily see a problem there. I think of it as on the constitutive model, the first principle constitutes everything. So everything is almost like an image of that deity. So to encounter that deity, first of all, the only things that we can encounter are things that are limited in a way that we can see. You can't see something that doesn't reflect light, for example. There are certain logistical requirements to having an experience. And I feel like what we encounter in myths and in experience, these are the gods, but they're not just the gods. It's like the gods aren't just that, I should say. Yeah, I think that's how I would go about that. So I feel like that answers the constitution versus causal, the self, the personal. So because everything is an image of the one, everything is an imitation, you might say. Whatever we are as a shadow almost of something that is the exemplar of that. So I feel like the gods are personal in a much more exemplary way than we are. Our personalness is just an imitation of them. So I feel like that's one way to argue that the gods aren't this abstract form that everything participates in, but they're, we can reason backwards from what we see around us that they are this, but so much more without limit, basically. And then, yeah, the no choice things. But yeah, that's all I got on that.
No, yeah, I like it. But it's funny. This is great. What I didn't expect was it to like feel like talking to a classical theist, which is this is fun. And because one way of putting the point you just made, contra my thing about like personhood, is something David Bentley Hart says about God being, he's a monotheist, but a classical theist, and he how did he phrase it? He says, well, God's not a person, but he's infinitely personal, or like he's perfectly personal, and like we're just have our personhood as a kind of like a vague, darkly through the glass, shadowy reflection of like the actual ideal of personality that is, God. So it seems like what you would say would be something similar. Yeah, and I'm interested in that too. Like I kind of agree, like I like the way you handled it there, where it's like, well, there is this interesting, it's not necessarily a problem, maybe it's a puzzle, this idea of like, okay, well, how do we get from these like Platonic things to like the experience somebody might have like walking through the woods, and like something that like, oh, Odin's speaking to me right now. And it's like, well, how do you connect that to this kind of like metaphysical theorizing? And it's like, well, there's a question there, but it's not clear that it's like insurmountable. One thing I was going to say too, on the point about emanation and like one, and like this is classically this it's also funny too how much like Eric Steinhardt similar views to you. I think you guys would get along on some of this, because he's very much so a fan of like the Neo-Platonic stuff, and like he's got a bunch of YouTube videos on like Plotinus and like oneness and emanation. It's great. So this is a classic thing people bring up with this view, which is the modal collapse objection, which again comes up in the philosophy of religion. And so you use this terminology of like, well, reality necessarily emanating from the one, and people take this to be, and but also, principle of charity you might not be meaning necessary the same way analytic philosophers mean necessary. So that's what I was going to ask too, for clarification of like, one thing people will say in response to this, or in response to this view, is like, well, on Neoplatonism, everything necessarily emanates from the one. But if everything necessarily emanates, there's no element of choice, then it just seems like all reality collapses into being necessary. And like, if we can't have that view, that just seems wrong. It's like run as a reductio. So some people just accept that. I mean, Timothy Williamson's not a Neoplatonist, but he's a necessitarian. But so some people might just accept that, but a lot of people find that kind of a repugnant conclusion of sorts. So like, just for clarity's sake, what would you say to that, or how would you address that if somebody like brought it up?
Well, on the one hand, I feel like the language of emanation is sort of metaphorical, because what the Platonist is saying is not that there is a process from the God's perspective in which reality just kind of ripples through nothingness and layer after layer of reality unfolds. There's not like this temporal process from the God's perspective. It's really a stratification of the totality of all things. You have the unity is present everywhere, and then you have, you might say, being is the next sphere, and then you have life, intellect, that sort of stuff. So there's layers to reality, and so that is the map of the procession of being, this emanation. To say that it is necessary, what I mean is, this is how the totality of all things is structured. I would say there's no possible world outside of the totality of all things. There's nothing outside of this. The totality of all things is the totality of all things. So this is the structure. This is just how it is. There's this, these different layers is, I guess, how I would word it. Where was I going with that? What was your second question?
Oh, I was still just on the thing about modal collapse.
Modal
like
collapse.
If it necessarily emanates, and it seems like, well,
Mhm.
then everything's necessary, and that just seems a conclusion people don't like. Yeah.
So the modal collapse is really interesting. I love all the new versions that keep coming out, because I just pick at the classical theists too. But
It's funny because this is one of the reasons I hate philosophy of religion now. It's like, I don't care about the 17th new version of the modal collapse objection to classical theism. Who cares? But teach.
I think it's funny.
Guess. Yeah. It is funny.
But it's symptomatic of the causal model of the first principle, because if you're talking about a cause, then you got to explain this in terms of cause and effect, these ordinary typical concepts. But on the constitutive model, we're not talking about a necessary cause and a necessary effect in this modal collapse. We're just talking about how things are constituted, the different layers of each thing. So my most fundamental layer is myself, my individuality, and then I'm myself has various predicates. As a subject, I have various predicates, you might say. So we're not looking at it as like a cause and effect, which could collapse modally. We're just talking about the constitution of it. So
cool. I like that clarification.
What's that? Makes sense. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like a similar point where you're saying about emanation. Like, you just have to kind of understand it in a certain way, and it's not, it's not this kind of view. So I like that. Yeah. Let's see. Did I have anything else here? The gods acting in the world. The question, had about that, and the mathematical Platonism, abstract. I think we covered most of what I had here, at least. I said, yeah, as far as surveying like objections to the view, I think we've kind of gone through them, like kind of some devil's advocate stuff as we've done this, and all the other objections had, like the mythically literalist stuff. Yeah, I do wonder then, because it is interesting. The interesting stuff then is like the stuff going forwards. Like, well, then how does all this connect to the various pantheons and like their interaction with humans and such? It's like, well, there's a lot. Seemingly, there's something to say about that, but I'm not sure what yet. That's cool. That's good.
I would add to mythicism and stuff. It's just that it makes sense on this position why you would interpret myth symbolically. That's not like a ad hoc way of saving the gods. It's like, if they really are so transcendent and simple, then you cannot depict them literally, because they're so simple. All you can do is symbolize them. So every element of a myth has to be symbolic, from the chronological ordering of it to birth, death, romantic relationship, everything. So like when it says, I think it's the Iliad that says Ares is hated most by Zeus, it makes sense from this perspective because Zeus is stability. That's his self. Everything participates in stability in that fashion, whereas Ares is division. Everything participates in Ares in that divine series. So stability hates division. They're opposed in nature. And so like that's how I interpret myth, is not as a being about the gods themselves necessarily, but their presence in nature, like Poseidon, change symbolized by the ocean, that kind of thing. Like there's a whole other depth I wish
Yeah.
I could get out there, but yeah.
No, that's cool stuff. Yeah, like Odin, wisdom. Like I find all that interesting
Mhm.
too. Yeah, as we talked about too, yeah, the allegorical readings are always the more interesting ones. And it's sort of going back to this point we talked about of like God or the gods not being persons, but being infinitely personal or whatever. In the same way, it's like, well, you can't like, I don't know, ascribe to them like certain properties, like X is Y's in the same way you can, but it can be like, well, X exemplifies wisdom, or something, which I'm not exactly clear how that would work without attributing properties, but that's kind of a side point. And a lot of the stuff with this is like just on my end of like my lack of like conceptual clarity about certain like Platonic principles. So it's good because I need to get back into more of this stuff. But yeah, no, I find it really interesting. Did you have other, like, as far as, I don't want to keep you too long here, but like, so that's a fun, like, I like that case and like the demonstration. But do you have like any other like arguments you kind of like to give, like maybe like it's like a grab bag? Because I wonder, like, if you had like a coffee shop conversation with somebody, you presumably wouldn't be like, so, okay, we're starting back with the Neoplatonists. Like if you had to give like a, yeah, I guess that's the question. Maybe this is an unfair question, but it's like if you had to give like a 5-minute bite size, like, hey, why are you a polytheist, dude? That's a weird view, like this incredulous stare thing. Because I feel like, again, most people who aren't philosophers, you're not going to alleviate the incredulous stare at all by giving them like Platonism. So, which, nothing against
Absolutely.
Platonism. It's like, I don't know, are there other things, I guess, or are there other considerations for you that go into it? Because also presumably, like, I don't know, like with your story of getting into this stuff, it's like I would imagine there were other factors that kind of pulled you in this direction before you came to this exact line of argument. So yeah, I don't know, what are some other things? You don't have to like go through, sorry, I know I've kept you a while already, but like, you don't have to go through like a huge list, but just like, what are some things, other stuff you like to talk about in relation to this?
Um, Yeah, my project right now is to try to condense this whole philosophy into more contemporary terms and stuff, more digestible terms. So I'm still working on that. This is definitely gonna take a while, but I want to do that ultimately. But if I got to sit down with somebody, especially like a family member, I feel like I would say something to the effect of, look, all the reasons that we had for monotheism aren't actually good. They're not. And in favor of polytheism, it's the most straightforward take of experience. And I might even throw this one out. I've been toying around with this one, but I could argue as an undermining objection that if there really is only one God, then religious experiences regularly track objects that don't exist. And if they regularly track objects that don't exist, then religious experience is an unreliable type of experience. So if monotheism is true, religious experience is an unreliable type of experience. And that removes all the religious experiences that found the Abrahamic faiths, from the visions of a resurrected Jesus to prophetic interactions with Yahweh. Yeah, if there's only one God, then religious experiences are deceptive. It'd be like if our eyes were telling us that there was a plurality of trees, and then there was this theory that said there's really only one tree. That theory would make that faculty unreliable. That says something's wrong with my eyes because it's telling me there's multiple trees. So that one's probably a little more bite-sized. I might throw that at a monotheist and see what they think.
I like that. Yeah, that's cool. It goes back a little bit to this inference to best explanation I think we talked about earlier, with like a straightforward, it's the most straightforward way to think about these things, or to interpret this kind of vast set of data. Cool. Yeah, I like that. I mean, so I guess the kind of the last thing I had slated to talk about. We sort of covered a little bit at the beginning, but that was like relation to spiritual practice. Like you mentioned a couple things, but um, like with paganism, like with the polytheistic paganism, or maybe, I mean, it's supposedly not all polytheists are pagans, but and not all pagans are polytheists, but I guess so. There's this distinct. There's like, okay, is the way you think about the gods and like their relation to religious / your spiritual life? Is it more so like what we think of paganism, or is it more so like something like the philosophy as a way of living kind of stuff that comes out of like, as you know, like the Epicurean school? Like that's one thing I like about like Brendan Meyer's book, and I know Pierre Hadot has a book on this too, where it's like talking about like philosophy is kind of like itself a spiritual exercise, and this the way the ancients conceived it. And so do you think like that's sort of like the kind of spiritual relation to the gods that is like that you have, or that people should have or do have, which is like, you know, kind of their as an extension of this like contemplating the forms or the unmoved mover or whatever? Or is it more so, I guess, this like mythic pagan way of interacting? Or is, I mean, I would assume you'd grant that they're all like valid ways of practicing like spirituality or whatever, but like for you and like your particular brand of polytheism, how does that relate to actual practice?
So actually, chapter 4 of this book, I keep bringing this up,
I say,
covers the relationship between humans and the gods. And I feel like there is definitely space for a devotional relationship to them at every level of our being. So intellectually, you can have a philosophical relationship to them as like this endless source of insight and mystery. But there's also more direct ways, I feel like, especially with creating and fostering an actual personal relationship, I would say, to the center of all things, that you can rely on in difficult times, that you can converse with at any point. And it's very heartfelt, I feel like, and it can foster habits such as devotional habits, you know, like prayer and so forth. But yeah, I feel like polytheism has a lot of space for differing practices, but that's kind of how I would say it.
cool. I like it. Thank you. All right. Let's see. So yeah, to sum up here, I guess I would say, well, thanks for coming on for one thing. This has been really fun. It's been stimulating, and I enjoy, you know, the kind of it seems like a different perspective, but through some parts of it through a similar lens. So I like that. But also, you know, I'm hopeful, I guess, about like doing this. Like one of the reasons we talked about, like one of the reasons I wanted to do this is because I want philosophy of religion to give other views a fairer shake, you know, and not just talk about. And Graham Oppy has a book pointing this out, and Felipe Leon, other like philosophers of religion, particularly atheists. I think Schellenberg has maybe even said similar stuff where I think even these guys are kind of getting bored about talking about Yahweh. They're just like, look, let's let's do something else. So so I'm hopeful that this will hopefully, you know, get people to engage with this more, respect it more, but also hopefully in addition to getting more people to read your books, also maybe you get you some interviews with some of these other people, or maybe debates even with. I'd love to see you debate like a classical theist. That'd be super enjoyable. So I'm hoping through this avenue you'll get to do some more stuff, assuming you want to. So all of that to say, I think this is a valuable project in terms of moving philosophy of religion forwards. And so I'm glad to, in some very limited secondary sense, be trying to help that. But so all that to say, I appreciate you doing this and talking to me, and you know, using your time here, especially during sort of turbulent times for all of us. So thank you, and yeah, this has been really fun. I enjoyed it. And if there's any other stuff we could talk about, I'd be happy to have you back on. But thanks for everything. And if you want to, and I'll link your books and stuff in like the description of this. But if there's anything else you want to plug or anything else you want to say, kind of in closing.
No, I thank you for the opportunity. Your questions were like super insightful, and like I said, I'm not a speaker yet, but I'm working on it, and I thought this was a lot of fun. Like I could definitely do this again.
Fantastic. Well, now speaking wise did great, and yeah, I'd be happy to have you back on. So we'll definitely be in touch. Thanks for this.